Hello, everybody, and welcome to your Ruby Live event. My name is Eric Wynkoop. I'm the Director of Culinary Instruction here at Ruby, and I'm one of your instructors. And so nice to see all of you today for my office hours. This is your chance to ask cooking and food-related questions, and my opportunity to do my best to answer them. And looks like we've got a number of questions already preloaded in the queue. So I look forward to a nice discussion with all of you. Now, as we get started, I'd like to cover just a couple of housekeeping tips. The first item is that if you would like to participate more directly in today's program, please enter your question or comment in the dialog box that you see in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. And that question or comment will make its way into the queue that you see on the right-hand side. The second item is, as you look at the list of questions already populated, you'll notice a heart-shaped icon in the upper right-hand corner of the individual question. If you'd like me to respond to that item sooner than later, you can click on that icon, and that will be pushed up in priority. Okay? But otherwise, we will make our way down the list and go ahead and jump on in. All right, here we go. The first item is from Laura. Laura, so nice to see you. Welcome back to the Plants Plus course. I hope you've been well. So when do you best use lime and when lemon in a dish or drink? They have a slightly similar taste and aroma, although lemon tastes and smells stronger to me. Is there any rule of thumb for their use? Well, this is an interesting question. I would say that first and foremost, it's one of personal preference and, perhaps cultural preference, depending on what it is that you're making, right? In some regions of the world, the lime, that green colored citrus fruit, is more commonly used. Other times it might be the yellow colored lemon. And in other places, it might be something entirely different. So I would say that those two items, personal preference as well as regional custom, will dictate. And then your question points direct or generally to the fruit. I will, also highlight the difference between the juice and the zest. And in that the zest contains more of the aroma. That's where we have a lot of those oils. And so this is why we often pull the zest off of the fruit and we'll use that separately from the juice, which tends to be more highly acidic and less aromatic. Okay. And so you can use those components of the fruit strategically as well, where acidity as a seasoning, right, is required. Or acidity for a reaction. For example, if it's going to be paired with baking soda in a quick bread, for example, okay, including things like pancakes. But otherwise, because many of the compounds in the aroma, the zest component, are fairly volatile. If you add that toward the end of cooking, you're going to preserve more of that flavor/aroma. Okay. And I say flavor/aroma because there's a lot of overlap between those two categories of sensory perception and description that we talk about. Okay. So let's go with that as the response to your first question. Thanks, Laura. All right, next question from Barbara. What are your favorite spices and spice blends you like to use? I am focused on plant-based dishes. Do you have a favorite source for your spices? My favorite spices to use, we've got a cabinet full of spices and a backup container of sorts downstairs. but some that come to mind are going to be black pepper and turmeric, which go hand in terms of their healthful benefits. The black pepper making turmeric more bioavailable for you. There's also cumin and coriander, green cardamom, black cardamom, and star anise, and cinnamon. Those are probably the most commonly used in our kitchen here at home, and that is going to be aligned primarily with South Asian flavors, specifically Indian flavors that we use a lot here at home. And that also gets us into Mexican cuisine, which we enjoy quite a lot as well. And in terms of spice blends, we're often using a garam masala, which is a hot blend that's going to be common to South Asian cooking. And garam masala varies incredibly. You can go to the store and buy a pre-made blend. That's a wonderful way to start to get to know different spices and spice combinations that might be blended for specific types of dishes, vegetable dishes of this sort or that sort, for example. Okay. And then, spices that I just mentioned, will also get you toward some Southeast Asian cooking, with the addition of some fresh items such as lemongrass and ginger and kaffir lime leaves and galangal, for example, not to mention other base ingredients like onions and garlic. Okay. So, that's, I think, a nice place to start. There are certainly many, many more to choose from, not to mention fresh herbs. And regardless, I'm a big fan of spices. Not only are they interesting from a culinary standpoint, aromatically and flavor wise, but they also pack a lot of phytonutrient health punch. And I will add spices to absolutely everything that I make, from my cup of water, which contains turmeric and black pepper today, as well as smoothies and pancakes and really everything else that I make. And I encourage you to do the same. All right. Thank you. All right. The next question. Hello, Harriet. Regards to baking, ovens have different racks. So how do you determine which rack is appropriate to bake a casserole, a cake, or cookies, etc.? Sometimes my dishes are undercooked and I have to increase the baking time. Please advise. You bet. So, in most cases, the default is the middle rack, somewhere in the center of the oven. The idea is that hopefully your oven heats evenly, okay, and you're going to get some even heat penetration from all around. All right. Another couple of things to keep in mind are that if your items are coming out undercooked, then let's take a look at where the undercooking is taking place relative to that item that you're baking. If the undercooked portion tends to be low in the pan, that means that there is a lack of what we call bottom heat, or heat coming from the bottom of the oven. In that case, we would position the rack at a lower position to get it closer to that heat element at the bottom of the oven, and we can find some balance in doing so. The next step would be to adjust oven temperature and baking time as needed. And then the opposite is going to be true. If you have more undercooked portion on the top, then we need more top heat, and we will move the rack up to a higher position. And you're going to get more heat that's reflected from the radiant heat that's reflected from the metal at the top of the oven to more evenly and quickly cook the top of that particular item. So there's going to be some experimentation required in order to get to know your particular equipment. Okay. A couple of other things that I'll mention is that, please provide adequate time to preheat the oven. So preheating is not simply allowing the ambient air temperature, in the oven to reach, say, 350 degrees Fahrenheit, when we hear the oven beep, but rather the walls of the oven need to heat up evenly and fully. And so I would give it a little bit of extra time to allow that heat to even out within that box. Okay. Also keep in mind that the back of the oven is hotter than the front of the oven near the door. And couple of reasons. Heat can escape even a little bit, or if we open the door to check on the product, then air is escaping and that front side is being exposed to cooler temperatures. So, keep that in mind as well. In case there's a need to rotate your product 180 degrees in order to even out the coloration, the color development, and the degree of doneness that you're looking for. Okay, so hopefully, those tips will help. But again, everyone's oven operates a little bit different. Okay, uniquely, in other words. And another item comes to mind, the last item here, and that is it's not uncommon for your oven to be inaccurate. So in other words, you might set your dial to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, but the thermostat in the oven might be a little bit off. And so if you suspect that, then I recommend that you purchase an oven thermometer that can be placed into the oven one way or another. Some of them are standalone small thermometers to be placed in the oven. Sometimes it might be a probe that you can stick through the side of the door, and then you'll have the readout on your countertop. And then you can get the real temperature inside the oven versus what the dial setting says. And then you can figure out how to make adjustments from there. All right, thank you. All right, next question from Doug. Is there a place for non-stick coated cookware in culinary arts, or was that an invention for the everyday person frying their morning eggs and bacon? I will say that non-stick pans are very commonly used in professional kitchens to cook eggs, especially. Eggs are pretty finicky, and non-stick surfaces are pretty convenient, and so they are commonly used, all right, in professional kitchens. Now, I'll share a couple of thoughts on non-stick cookware for really for anywhere, whether it's a pro kitchen, but especially I think in the home kitchen for today's conversation. And that is to say that I do not recommend buying a full set of non-stick cookware because in my experience over time, non-stick surfaces will acquire micro scratches, which eventually will lead to the non-stick cookware sticking. So in my opinion, non-stick cookware is disposable. And with that in mind, I will buy one or maybe two pieces of non-stick cookware as needed. And, I'll use that for as long as I can. And then I toss it out, and then we'll go buy another one. Now, in terms of what to buy, there is a lot of concern on one hand among some people. There are some strong opinions and preferences among other people. So, I'll let you read and study and sort of figure out the answer ultimately for yourself. However, I will mention that I run down to the nearby restaurant supply store and will pick up what they have on their shelf. And, it's equipment that was familiar to me when I was working in pro kitchens, and I continue to use those sorts of things at home right now. A common brand that I see is Volrath. And Volrath is an American company that makes a lot of different cookware, and non-stick products are among their offerings. Okay, so give that a try and see how you like it. Thank you. All right, Laura is back. I've learned that there are words to describe the aroma of a food and words for taste. But how do you best explain the flavor of a dish if flavor is defined as a combination of both aroma and taste? Yes, this is a fun question. We think about flavor as as you mentioned, a combination of all these sensory activities. In fact, even more than taste and aroma, it is affected by your mood, by your state of health, by the ambiance as well. Noise can play a factor. Lighting can play a factor in the way that we perceive flavor. It's very, very interesting. And therefore, each person's experience is unique. Sometimes, largely, or maybe I should say, often largely the same as the next person, but there are nuances, the differences that people experience. So, as we isolate taste and aroma, we think about flavors being dependent on aroma significantly to the tune of maybe 75% or perhaps more, according to some people. Okay, so very often we start out by describing flavors with words that we might also describe aromas by. Okay, and aromas are often denoting something that we're familiar with. For example, raspberries, a raspberry aroma. We're pointing to that specific food item in the hopes that our audience is familiar with that particular item. Raspberries have a sort of a range of aroma depending on the type of raspberry, depending on the degree of ripeness, depending on the ambient air temperature. It could be the time of day. Is it still very cool in the morning? Or is it in the afternoon when the raspberry has absorbed the direct warmth of the sun? Those things can affect the aroma. So even there's going to be some range of possibilities. And so things can get very nuanced. But if we sort of back out a little bit and talk about it more generally, we can, again, point to food items that tend to be common culturally. Okay. And I think you'll find that that's how aromas are often denoted. Now, in terms of getting to know vocabulary, okay, a fun way to start is to use the aroma wheel that is common to wine studies. And the aroma wheel is broken up into fruity notes and floral notes and, other earthy and other categories of aromas. And start there. You can branch into lists that have a more culinary focus. In fact, Laura, if you reach out to me at support@ruby.com, I can direct you to a chart, a PDF that we have that gets you going in this area as well. Okay. But the next part is to smell a food and then to put it into your mouth and then try it so that you can start to sort of build your sensory package around that particular item, and then start to combine it with other ingredients and in other food contexts in order to understand how those aromas, tastes, flavors change in the presence of other compounds. Okay. And have some fun with it. It's a process, and I hope you enjoy the journey. Thank you. All right. Excellent. We've got the winearomawheel.com posted, so check out that link below your question, Laura. Thank you. All right. Next up from Claudia. I have tried making caramelized onions without oil with limited success. What do I need to do to get them nicely browned and sweet? Aha. So this is a bit of a challenge, right? This is one of the beauties of using fat in cooking. It facilitates the transference of heat and therefore the development of color, browning, and therefore flavor and visual appeal. And without oil, things happen a little differently. So we can certainly get results that are pretty close, I'd say, although they might not be exactly the same. So do be prepared for results that might be a little bit different from what you may have been used to while cooking with fat. Okay, but the goal here is to use moderate heat. Okay, and I don't have a specific temperature for that, but if it's high heat, you're bound to burn the food because fat also acts to insulate the food from heat. All right, as it transfers heat in a more even fashion. So, in the absence of fat, then use a relatively lower heat setting. Have some liquid. It could be water, but a flavorful liquid is often what we reach for. It's going to be appropriate for what it is that you're making. So stock is very commonly used. And, as we see the color developing on the onions, move them around, with your spatula, move them around so that they turn over and the different sides of the cuts make contact with the pan in order to promote the most even browning. If browning is occurring too vigorously, then deglaze the pan with some of your liquid. So the liquid is going to do two things. Number one is going to loosen any product that might be sticking to the pan and allow you to move it about a little bit easier so that it doesn't sit in one place and burn. And number two, the liquid will cool down the surface of the pan. Okay. And so when we're using a no oil saute process, which is relatively higher heat than a no oil sweating process. Okay. So with no oil saute, we go through this cycle of, letting the pan get hot and impart color onto the food, and then cooling down the pan with the addition of the deglazing liquid, and then letting that evaporate, letting the pan heat up, letting more color develop, cooling the pan down with the addition of the deglazing liquid. Okay, so give that a try. As with all cooking methods and techniques, practice makes you better. There's nothing like repetition to get you down the path faster. Okay, so give it a try. Use moderate heat and enjoy the process. Thank you. All right, next up, table salt, sea salt, kosher salt. What's the difference? Does it matter in recipes? So, some of these products will have iodine added, and table salt commonly does. Sea salt can, sometimes it doesn't. Kosher salt doesn't. There's also flake size, and some are very small and hard, like table salt usually is. Kosher salt, on the other hand, has larger, less dense flakes. They tend to melt very quickly as a result of their lower relative density. And then, going beyond your list here, there are other examples that are, more sort of chunky in their shape, like a small rock. And and you just have to look at these individually to see how quickly they might melt, in certain environments. Okay. Let's see. Salts have different flavors associated with them based upon their extent of refinement or the extent of minerals that might be attached to them. And so when we talk about, in particular, sea salts that are from different parts of the world, there's these red and orange salts from Hawaii. There are gray salts from northern France, and so on and so forth. I mean, every region of the world has their own local salts, and there will be different minerals and different mineral, I'll say, ratios that produce different flavors. And, some of these salts are just really beautiful. I mean, just super flavorful, especially when you compare them to salts that are refined, like a kosher salt or a table salt. And so, I recommend tasting salts, doing a salt tasting. In some cases, grocery stores will sell small sets of maybe 6 or 10 different salts that you can buy and have some fun with. And then you might decide to use one salt in certain preparations and a different salt in other preparations. Okay, you might also find that in some contexts like baking, that certain bakers or certain authors of recipes preferred a certain salt, and therefore they specify that in the recipe. So, at least initially, I recommend following along with those instructions, particularly in the world of baking, so that flavors and things stay consistent. Okay, but otherwise for the cuisine kitchen, um, you can basically use any salt that you want. Again, there are differences, and some people will split hairs over this and get really specific. But just try some different things and see how you pick up the results as being similar or different from what you were doing before. The other thing to mention is that a lot of literature, including some of our course content here at Ruby, will, for example, say that fleur de sel is to be used only for finishing. And that sort of direction is given within the context of the price of a product like fleur de sel, which tends to be pretty expensive, relative to, say, kosher salt, which we use on a daily basis very commonly. But if you are in a position to use something like fleur de sel on a daily basis, on a regular basis for all of your cooking needs, feel free to do so. It tastes wonderful. Thanks. All right, next up is a question from Stanley. It is easier to use an electronic sharpener. Should they be avoided, or would you recommend one? They're fine. Yeah, I think the idea of using some sort of a mechanical device, whether it's electronic, electric, or just a jig of some sort, a mechanical jig of some sort, versus using a whetstone freehand to sharpen your knives. There are pluses and minuses both ways. And, for example, for a whetstone or a set of whetstones, 2 or 3 stones typically, it takes a lot of practice to move up that learning curve in order to produce results that are consistently good with your knife. Excuse me. In the meantime, as you're working your way up the learning curve, I recommend that you use a practice knife, some less expensive knife, because you're bound to grind away a lot of your blade as you're practicing. Now, on the other side, to use some sort of a device, again, electronic, as you referenced, I think that's fine. You're going to get some immediate results that are pretty consistent, and it's certainly going to benefit a dull knife. Now, arguably, a sharpener that has developed skill on a whetstone can produce results that are better than an electric or electronic device, because you can really adjust to what is going on between the blade and the whetstone. But again, it takes a while to get there, and some people may never get there, frankly. So I don't have any problems working with the product that I think you have in mind. Thank you. All right, Julietta, first in a series of questions. Is it okay to freeze herbs in ice cubes? Yes, quick answer would be yes. I'm envisioning what that could look like. And, what I envision is some excess herbs that are pureed and then placed into an ice cube tray and then frozen in small portions. Those can be popped out of the tray and then held in some sort of a container, whether it's a Ziploc bag or something else for your convenience. Okay, but I think that's a nice way to capture the essence of that product when it's no longer available to you in its fresh state. Now, of course, the way that you can apply that herb is going to be limited, right, to soups and stews and sauces. But you bet, give that preservation method a try. Thank you. Next up, in the pan, when dry sauteing, what temperature is medium and what is medium-high heat? I don't know. There really is no set temperature or even necessarily a temperature range. Let me explain the context of my response, Julietta. First of all, when we're cooking on a given burner, right, it's putting out, or it has a maximum, I should say, of a certain number of BTUs, just its power rating, right? And if you, for example, have a 4-burner range, there's a good chance that those 4 burners each have a different BTU rating. So as you adjust that burner to a medium or a medium high setting, they're all going to be at a different power level. And so it's really a relative label, right? Medium. It's medium versus low. It's higher than low and lower than high. And this is the beauty of cooking. Okay, this is when we start to talk about the art of cooking, right? Having a feel for cooking, where with experience, we will learn to adapt to the equipment that are using. In this case, I mentioned your stovetop or your range. It may also refer to the particular pan, right, or type of cookware that you're using, where some materials conduct heat faster than others, such as copper compared to cast iron. Okay. It also will depend upon the food item that you're cooking. If it's something cut small and something that otherwise is known to burn easily, like minced garlic, relative to a larger cut broccoli, then what medium sort of heat you can work with will differ. Okay, and so keep an open mind, and don't be bound to temperatures that could be associated with those words, because I think in the long run, it may not be the smoothest way toward better cooking. Okay, so practice and relax and get a feel for the cooking. Thank you. All right, next question. What do you think about using dill, develop a salty flavor in the basic vegetable stock recipe that will be used in the cabbage soup recipe? I had always been taught that dill could add a salty taste. A dill and cabbage is a German standard cooking combo. Okay. Yes, interesting. I don't immediately associate saltiness with dill, but definitely if you pick up saltiness relative to the use of dill, then that's I think a nice indicator, right, of how you might further develop flavor and season the dish. If you're picking up saltiness in the stock and it has, you added dill to it, then that's a strategy I think that you can use, right, to adjust the flavor and the seasoning of that component of the next step, which is the soup recipe that you might be making. Okay. And Yeah, I think the idea of combining dill and cabbage, I relate to that. I relate to those flavors, um, as being compatible and pleasing on the palate. Um, to me, it's different from the saltiness, but again, I'll leave that to you, the individual cook and your experiences. All right, thank you. All right, next up from Lisa. What vegetable scraps do you use for making broth or stock? I would first of all say, use the standard mirepoix, which consists of onion and celery, um, and carrots, and then adjust from there. For example, if you want less bitterness and grassiness from the celery, decrease that. You might increase the onion for sweetness. If you want some garlic, you can certainly add that. And then if you want to sort of nudge that stock in a particular regional flavor profile, then maybe you add, kaffir lime leaves and ginger to point it toward dishes from Southeast Asia. Or you might, add some chilies or cumin and coriander to, nudge it toward more of a Mexican flavor profile that could be used in some different dishes from that part of the world. So that's how I would approach it. Start with the baseline. The mirepoix is going to be pretty common across the spectrum of cooking, at least in the Euro-American context, and then tailor it from there. All right, thank you. Next up from Gustav, when cooking premium thick steak, when is the best time to add salt? I will add salt generally just before placing it on the grill or on the heat surface, and then season it toward the end as desired. Okay. And, I don't know that there's necessarily a best time, as in exclusively a single time that is best. But to give the salt a little bit of a chance to melt on the surface and to be drawn into the tissue prior to putting it on the hot surface is pretty common, as a technique. Give it a try, see how you like those results, and then make adjustments as you experiment. Thank you. And the next question. Getting started and working daily on the course, trying to schedule a shopping trip 1 to 2 times weekly. I understand there is some flexibility. However, what is the best way to find specific ingredients needed in order to create a shopping list? Yes. So first of all, let me put all this shopping into context, and that is to say that, as you move through our courses for a given unit or lesson or assignment, you will typically be given multiple recipes to choose from, 2, 3, 4, 5 recipes to choose from. So, not everyone's shopping list will look the same, just from that starting point, but also the quantity that you might shop for will depend upon your situation. Sometimes our students will make substitutions, ingredient substitutions. That could be based upon, any reason why a person wouldn't or can't consume an ingredient, or sometimes due to the lack of availability of an ingredient seasonally or just in a particular marketplace, for example. So therefore, your shopping list will probably be unique. Okay. But what I recommend you do is to look ahead a couple, 3, 4, 5 tasks as needed, and look at the practice recipes, right, or the assignment recipe that you want to make, and then write down those ingredients, make adjustments as needed, and then go to your store or stores that will have those ingredients. And also keep in mind that ordering online is certainly an option these days, as well as ordering from a local grocer and having it delivered to your house. And so there are, I think, plenty of ways that you might go about actually acquiring the ingredients after you have determined your unique shopping list. Okay. And, in some cases, if you're dealing with specialty items, while, most mainstream, like large grocery stores will carry a lot of specialty goods these days, it might be necessary for you to go online to a specialty purveyor to order that product. Okay. Thank you. All right. Valentina says, I'm in the Essential Vegan Desserts course and loving it. Do you have any tips about how to choose quality baking sheets? Okay. So, I will begin by saying that different bakers, different cooks have their own preferences, whether they might use stainless steel or aluminum or a silver or a black sheet pan. All right. Excuse me. I will say that, I use silver aluminum pans. They are just what I've grown up with in the kitchen. I'm very comfortable with them. I don't have any concerns with the aluminum. I always line my pans with parchment paper or some sort of a silicone baking mat. All right. Now, I think it's important to consider a couple of other things. One is the construction. In other words, the thickness or the gauge of the material. And I would recommend at the lightest an 18 gauge sheet pan. You can get them thinner, 20 gauge or 22 gauge would be a thinner, lighter weight pan. 18 gauge is, I think, a reasonable weight, a reasonable durability to last a very long time. And if they're reasonably well cared for, they can last a lifetime or more. If you foresee some really heavy usage, for example, in perhaps developing a baking business, or certainly in a business setting, you might consider something that's heavier gauge. The heaviest that I'm familiar with is 13 gauge, which is pretty tough stuff. That'll last a long time under some pretty heavy use. Okay. And then the other thing to consider would be the size. A full size sheet pan, which is used in professional kitchens, measures typically 18 inches by about 26 or so inches. And then from there, we have a 3/4 sheet pan, a half sheet pan, quarter sheet pan, and an eighth sheet pan. And, in the home oven spectrum, a half sheet pan and a quarter sheet pan are very convenient. And then you might also look at the dimensions of a 3/4 sheet pan to see if that might work for you as well. But also keep in mind that a 3/4 size sheet pan, while they're available, it's a bit of an odd size. And if you plan to use silicone baking mat, like a Silpat brand product, you might see if a 3/4 size is available. I know a half is and a quarter is, in addition to the full size. So those are what's routinely used. In the case of parchment paper, a full sheet of parchment paper can easily be cut in half or into quarters to accommodate those sizes. All right. So keep those things in mind as you select sheet pans. Thank you. Hey, Louie, good to see you. My question is about desserts. For cakes, what's your go-to egg replacer? I reach for Bob's Red Mill product. That's one that I would recommend, as well as generally speaking, their products across the board. But bobsredmill.com. Check them out. Thank you. Hello, Hilda. What's your favorite spices as a rub on chicken and lamb for roasting? We really like spices from around the world, especially peppers and chiles. Well, I think it really can depend upon what flavor profile I'm after, right, in terms of the regional cuisine type. And I hope that you will think about that as well. And, as I mentioned a little bit earlier in today's program, we always have at least one, if not two or three varieties of garam masala in the pantry. And that might be something that is blended here at home. On occasion, we'll pick up something from a nearby Indian grocery store. But you can certainly, make your own very easily. And so, chicken can go in any direction, right? Chicken is a pretty neutral base, and you can use these, things like, fennel seed and black pepper and, cumin and coriander to take you in a certain direction. Or, you might um, marinate that product in buttermilk overnight and then do something very simple like cloves and black pepper with salt to give it a certain European continental simplicity, allowing the tanginess from the buttermilk and the sweetness from the chicken to be most prominent. And then if it's something reminiscent of Mexican cuisine, then I typically will make some sort of a wet rub or marinade from dried chilies and also garlic and onions and roasted tomatoes that can be blended. And you can let that sit overnight or 2 or 3 if you want, whether that's lamb or chicken or something else. And then adjust salt to your preference and then have fun with it. All right. Thank you. All right. Thank you. We see the bobsredmeal.com link for your reference, Louis, and others. Thank you. Next question from Lisa. When will you add garlic that was sweated to a dish? Now, very typically, if you're sweating garlic as a first step or a very early step, say with garlic or garlic ginger chilies, as you're making a foundation for a certain sauce or a curry or something else, then you'll take care of the garlic at the same time. That's all done with moderate heat at best. I'd say even moderately low heat, so you don't impart any color. With a lid to keep the moisture in, letting it steam and draw out flavors in a way. But really more importantly is to mellow some of the harsh flavors, often bitterness that we might associate with garlic as well as onions and other aromatics. And that's the common way of handling that. Okay. Now, if you foresee some high heat being used early, then you can certainly sweat garlic off to the side and then add it later on, after the high heat work has been done. And very often, once we add more bulk to the pan, then the temperature is better moderated, and we can add garlic at that point with almost no risk of burning. Of course, that really just depends on exactly what's going on, but that's another way to think about when to add garlic, right? When the temperature is buffered by a larger bulk of food in the pan. All right, so give that a try and see how you like the results. Thank you. All right, next question. I've tried to locate star anise in my area and looked in 5 stores with no luck. Am I looking in the wrong areas of the store? Thank you. Well, in your typical mainstream grocery store, at least in the United States where I am, you're going to find star anise in the spice section. Now, you might also visit an Indian grocery store, right? Or a Thai grocery store or a Vietnamese grocery store and ask if they have star anise. And then another approach would be to look online to find a vendor that can mail it directly to you. All right, thank you. All right, next question. What ingredients do you recommend to use to get a plant-based dessert to rise as well as be soft? Well, now, so I think we're talking baked items here. And I'm going to assume we are. So in terms of rising, right, some sort of a leavening agent is most commonly used, and baking powder is very easy to use. Baking powder that we find in most all cases is a two-stage baking powder, meaning it's got a couple of different chemicals. One will start to react with acid, much in the same way as baking soda does. And then the second stage reacts with the heat of the oven. And so you've got some time, right, to incorporate ingredients and then to get it into the oven with the two-stage chemical reaction. And then, in terms of softness, there are some different things that affect the softness of an item. Sugar content and fat content, first and foremost. In other words, the more sugar and the more fat, the more tender, right, or soft the baked good will be. So if we start to pull back on those ingredient categories, we're going to create some very different end products. Okay. Now, making those adjustments isn't always as simple as simply increasing or decreasing sugar or fat, because they can affect other aspects of the baked item. Okay. But do keep those things in mind, basically, right, as you're approaching baked goods. You can start by adding a little bit more baking powder, and then take a look at the results. And then you can start to adjust sugar and then fat, individually. Okay. And that way you can start to isolate the ingredient that gives you the desired effect. All right. Thank you. All right. Next question from Lucero. How are we able to extend shelf life of baked goods? And how do we turn our passion into profit? Any tips? Wow. Okay. So, first part of your question here, in terms of extending the life of baked goods, if you want to preserve baked goods, the recommendation would be to wrap them tightly, in an airtight sort of plastic wrap, for example, or container, and then freeze it rather than place it in the refrigerator. Okay. And then how do we turn our passion into profit? So this is a big question. In the food related world, there are many, many, many different ways that one might be able to monetize, their skill and knowledge set. And this could be, cooking specifically on a, for somebody else, right? In a restaurant or in their cafe, their bakery, or it could be starting your own business. Whether it's a catering company of some sort, savory food or sweet items, so on and so forth. It might be food photography. It could be writing. It could be research of some sort. So there are, different ways that you might approach, any particular interest that you might have. But, this is a pretty big topic. I recommend that you do some, first of all, some reading of resources online. There are many, many people that discuss this topic based upon their experience. Okay. I always recommend a business plan. That's just my approach to these sorts of things. And a business plan provides you with a roadmap of sorts, really guiding you to address certain questions in the process of setting up a business. Whether it's in the area of product development or marketing or something else. And, one place to start in relative to producing a business plan is to reach out to the business advisors at score.org. And SCORE is a subgroup of the U.S. Small Business Administration, the SBA. And, they provide a service to small business owners that are getting started or otherwise want coaching in their entrepreneurial endeavor. All right, give that a try. Thank you. Hello, Carol Ann. Could you please explain what is the difference between tempering and seeding chocolate? Okay, I'll give you a quick answer here. Tempering is a general technique that is applied to chocolate. This is going to be a better quality chocolate that contains cocoa butter in order to create a finished product that has a nice shine to it and a crisp snap. Those are characteristic of good quality chocolate. And the cocoa butter needs to pass through different states through a rise and decrease in temperature. And it's very specific, ranging from 89 degrees to 93 or 4 or so degrees. And the result then, if done properly, is a shiny, snappy end product. Okay. Now, seeding is a particular technique for tempering, whereby once you melt chocolate that is not tempered, you can add to that chocolate pieces or seeds of tempered chocolate. And it will help the other melted chocolate sort of fall in line in terms of the crystalline structure and help that whole volume become tempered. Okay, so seeding is a technique for tempering. All right, thank you. All right, next up from Dennis. With recent dry heat activity, I added garlic mushrooms to wheat pasta. I found that the pasta was very dry. Absent adding any oil, what are your suggestions for how best to add moisture and more taste and flavor to the pasta? So, one thing to consider is to reserve some of the pasta cooking water, and then that can be added to the dish as you're finishing it. And that will add moisture, obviously, from the water, but then also a little bit of creaminess from the starches that are present in that water that will then gelatinize, in that hot pan that we're talking about. Another approach would be to create a separate sauce. And you might try something like a cashew bechamel or a cashew white sauce. That will definitely add moisture and a whole different experience to the pasta dish that you're making. All right, give that a try. Thank you. All right, next question. What are some of the best seasonings that give roasted veggies a depth of flavor when replacing salt? So this is where we start thinking about the use of spices and herbs. And as a starting point, I recommend looking at a resource like the Flavor Bible or the Vegetarian Flavor Bible. There are other, similar resources, but that's one that comes to mind. There's actually 2 different books by the same authors. And that book will run you through a number of different flavor combinations based upon regional cuisines, and just other popular combinations. It's a great place to start. And then from there, you can start branching off on your own. Okay. But yeah, I do agree with you that adding more flavor and aroma are very important when you are reducing or eliminating salt. Thank you. All right. Alice says, can you recommend a chef knife for someone with very tiny hands? I have trouble gripping my knife. Okay. Well, a couple of things come to mind, Alice. And without actually being with you to see specifically what's going on, I'll just provide some general information. Okay, and that is number one: if the overall knife is too big, including the length, first consider a shorter chef's knife, and I have seen them as short as about probably a 5-inch blade, which is really short and appropriate for people that have smaller hands. Now, the other consideration is going to be the size of the handle as you talk about gripping the knife. And, if the handle size is too big, then, we've got a couple of choices here. We can shift to a different style of knife, such as a utility knife, or you might consider a custom-made knife, in which case, of course, you can specify a handle shape and size that will be tailored to your hand. Okay, but give that a try. First of all, a shorter blade and therefore an overall smaller knife, but then also possibly a utility knife could be comfortable for you. Thank you. All right, Carmen says, since going plant-based, my partner and I eat beans for breakfast and greens. We notice that we are having more gas. Any tips on reducing gas in general or preparing beans in specific? Yes, let's talk about gas. When cooking beans, I recommend adding something like asafoetida. If you go to an Indian grocery store, you can ask for hing, H-I-N-G. It's a spice, and give that a little sprinkling in the water, as you cook your beans, and that is known to decrease gassiness. Also, from Mexican cuisine comes the herb called epazote, and the addition of epazote has anti-flatulent properties to it. So give that a try. And I have also read that kombu, kelp, has similar effects. So try those. I use most commonly asafoetida and occasionally epazote. I make a lot of things with kombu, but usually not beans. So I haven't associated that with gaseous results. But give that a try and see what you like. Thank you. All right, next question. Do you have a savory salad dressing recommendation which does not use cashews or oils? My husband is watching his cholesterol and need to avoid saturated fats, we are told. Yes. How about if you try some sort of a furikake? And, a furikake is a general sort of category label that includes these dry sprinkles. Furikake comes from the Japanese language, and many of them, if you look it up, are going to be Japanese in style. But, and anyway, you'll find some sort of a dry herb, vegetable, fruit rind sprinkling that provides aroma and flavor. And that's one place to start. Also, spices and fresh herbs go a long way. I'm a big fan of adding multiple fresh herbs to my salads. And where possible, I will use the whole leaf or large pieces of the leaf rather than cutting it up, so that you're eating a leaf of herb along with a leaf of lettuce, for example. And it provides just a wonderful explosion, a symphony of sorts of aromas and enjoyment. And I hope you'll give that a try. It's a really easy way to make adjustments and bring interest to your salads. All right, thank you. And next up from Cassie, I heated a stainless steel pan to the mercury ball stage for the mushroom task. It appeared too hot. By the time the mushrooms were caramelized, the garlic was burned. It didn't deglaze either. What did I do wrong? Cassie, indeed, it sounds like the pan was too hot. And what you've experienced is really part of the learning curve, okay? As disappointing as it might be to burn the garlic and otherwise come up with results that you weren't imagining, it's, in my opinion, an important stepping stone, right, down your path of cooking. And so as we start to heat up the pan, using this so-called mercury ball test, please pay attention to the feel of the pan. So put your hands over the pan and then put your face over the pan to feel the heat. You'll feel it on your arms, okay? And you'll more quickly learn to moderate the temperature of the pan via these inputs. And so next time, simply lower the temperature or let the pan cool down, and you can avoid the burning. Now, I will also add that the so-called mercury ball test is a technique to allow us to learn about how our particular pan heats up. But the goal, okay, as I just mentioned, is to really engage with the process and to learn to control that heat along the way so that we no longer need to use the mercury ball test after a few tries. Okay, you'll get there. Thank you. All right, next up, the lemon sour cream pound cake does not rise as high for me as I think it should. I had the correct pan size, the batter is not overmixed, and all the ingredients are scaled correctly and at correct temperature. Do you have any suggestions? Well, now, you might experiment with the quantity of the leavener. Keep in mind that chemical leaveners, like baking powder, if they have been in our inventory for a long time, they will diminish in freshness and therefore their ability to create bubbles, gas, and to create the rising effect that we're after. So, you might consider either increasing the quantity a bit or even renewing your product if you think it might be old. Thank you. All right, Debbie writes, I've heard that it is not good to refreeze something once you have defrosted it. With that said, when we are doing batch cooking and use a frozen vegetable, is it wrong to freeze this new food knowing an ingredient has already been frozen? Well, this is a good question, Debbie. So, let me explain the comment, right, that you've heard about don't refreeze food. So as we freeze for the first time a fresh food item, especially a fruit or vegetable, but it could be a meat as well, as water freezes, it expands. And as it expands, it will tear or rupture the individual cell walls, such that when we thaw that food item, it loses its structure. It becomes flaccid. It becomes wilted and soft. And so the idea of then refreezing that item again will further deteriorate that item. It's a hard process on the food, this freezing and thawing cycle. So that's where that guidance comes from. Now, does that mean you can't refreeze a previously frozen item? No, not at all. You can certainly refreeze it if you want to. I recommend that you give it a try and see how you like the results. Okay. Now, there's another angle to this, and that is a food safety angle. Okay. Um, if an item has been at room temperature, and here I'm really talking about a leftover food item, like a previously cooked item. Okay. So if it's been at room temperature, or in other words, in the so-called danger zone between, 41 degrees Fahrenheit and 135 degrees Fahrenheit, then any microorganisms have the best chance of replication. Now, we're usually talking about spoilage bacteria, okay? But within the discussion of food safety, we often bring up pathogens, right? Or disease-causing microorganisms. Even though the chances of them being present are smaller than spoilage bacteria, which is always present, the consequences of having pathogens present can be deadly. Okay, so we always talk about these. All right. So as we go through a freeze cycle and then thaw the food item, as it comes back up to a cooking temperature, it goes through the danger zone again. And if that product is left over and frozen again, and then thawed and then brought back up to service temperature of 165 degrees, then it's gone through the temperature danger zone once again. And so, each time that happens, there's a chance of the bacteria, whether it's spoilage bacteria or pathogens, sort of continuing to multiply. And so there could possibly be a food safety concern depending on how the food has been handled. Okay. And so that could be another reason why folks might suggest that you don't repeatedly refreeze a food item. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, so there's a quality issue as well as possibly, a food safety concern, or more commonly, just a spoilage concern. Okay, thank you. Next question from Lynn. What do you think about dehydrating herbs with the microwave and storing them under a vacuum to use at a later date? I have been doing this method when I have a garden surplus. I think we're talking about food preservation at this point, right? And if it works for you, I think it's fantastic. This is a technique that one might consider, as well as the very first question in today's program, which addressed freezing herbs in the form of ice cubes. Okay, so definitely try out this technique and see how it works for you. Okay, thank you. And next question from Stanley. Should we sharpen our knives with electric sharpeners? And if so, would you recommend one? This is very similar to the earlier answered question. Yes, as a convenience product or a tool or appliance, definitely an electric sharpener is better, than continuing to use a dull knife. Okay. And I think for many people, the results of an electric sharpener can be quite adequate for their cooking. If you are a person that really geeks out on the nuances of cooking and tools and all the technology that goes along with cooking, then you might try your hand at using a set of whetstones, in which case just be prepared for the learning curve. all right, and ample practice to get you to the top of that curve. Thank you. Next up, Maria writes, how would you introduce foreign gastronomies, in this case, healthy alternatives to the healthcare world? Can you enlighten us about Ayurveda and the chef profession? Okay, Maria, you have asked 3 huge questions, but let me just touch upon each one of them very briefly here. So introducing healthy alternatives to the healthcare world. This calls for a drink. So when you say the healthcare world, I'm envisioning a hospital setting, and I'm envisioning the food service director, right, or the executive chef, perhaps, at this hospital. In which case, a discussion, right, is going to be required with other members of the stakeholding team, so the dietetics department and others that have their hand in the food that goes out to the patients. And I think some cooking demonstrations and some sharing of literature would be a part of this discussion. I know that in most hospitals, the number one concern when it comes to providing food to inpatient patients is to simply get them to eat something so that they've got some energy coming into their bodies to hopefully help them recover. Although I agree that the quality of that food is very important too. Okay. But in terms of the politics here, the primary concern is to get them to eat something that is familiar to them. Hence, the typical foods that we still see in hospitals. So it's going to be a strategic decision on your part to introduce information for education, and then also providing samples of tasty cooking that perhaps replicates familiar foods. If it strays too far from what might be considered mainstream familiar, then you're going to be unsuccessful coming out of the gate. But if you can start out with items that are already on the menu, but tweaking those items in a way that make them better for you, then that may be the best starting point. Okay. Now on to the second part of your questions here. Can you enlighten us about Ayurveda? Yes, but probably not in just a couple of minutes. Okay. I will briefly explain for those of you in the audience that are unfamiliar with Ayurveda, and by saying that Ayurveda is a full-blown medical discipline, okay, that is part of the South Asian and Indian. In my context of knowledge, it's within an Indian context, although Ayurveda is certainly used in Sri Lanka and in Nepal and other places, for example. But in India, for example, it is recognized by the Indian government, along with allopathic medicine, or the Western medicine that many of us are familiar with, and other forms of medicine. Okay. Ayurveda is based on a couple of principles, but one big one is to look at what are called doshas. And there are 3 doshas. Doshas can be described as biopsychoenergies that govern our physical and mental well-being. And there's also a spiritual component to it. Okay. And so the 3 doshas are Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. And Vata, very briefly, is characterized by movement, Pitta by heat and fire, and Kapha by stationary, heavy, earthy sort of elements. And each one of us is characterized by all three of these doshas, but in varying quantities. Okay, so that each one of us has a unique balance that is our own. And so we have a baseline balance, the prakriti that we were born with. That is our ideal balance. And then we have the imbalanced state, the vikriti, that is often what we're working with today when we have, a cold or a diseased state. And we're trying to revert back to our baseline balanced state through different treatments. And so that's one way that I'll frame Ayurveda. There's much, much, much more to it. Again, it's not a simple field of study, but really a medical field of study. I see that we have a link presented to one of our past live events where I provide an introduction to Ayurveda, and I hope that you will take a look at that to learn a little bit more. Okay? And then the last part, can you enlighten us about the chef profession? I will say just a couple of things. One is that basically whatever you have seen on the Food Network and similar programming is largely false. The food industry is at once a tough and challenging field to make a living in. And at the same time, it's one of the most wonderful places to make a living in if you are aligned with the challenges and the joys that come with cooking and taking care of people. Making a living, as a chef comes in many, many different guises. From small establishments to large, from standalone eateries to hotel restaurant properties, to catering companies, to just so many different ways to do that. Which is one of the beauties, right, of the industry. You can really find your path if this sort of thing is for you. But there are many challenges along the way, and I always recommend that a person work for somebody else in order to learn about all of the idiosyncrasies of this industry, or at least that branch of the industry that you're interested in, before you venture out on your own. Because any sort of areas of lack of knowledge or mistakes along the way can be quite costly, and they can be easily avoided by getting some experience under your belt while on somebody else's payroll. So anyway, continue to talk with other people and to read the many blogs and books that are out there that talk about life as a chef or a food service professional in some way, okay, to learn more about that. Thank you. And Julietta says, P.S., but I have a laser meter. And I think this is in continuation of the what does medium heat or medium high heat mean. And still, I don't know, Julietta. As I mentioned, it depends upon the equipment that you're using, and it's all relative to what it is that you're cooking. Okay, so if you want to start creating your own reference, then go ahead and start shooting temperatures of your particular cookware on your particular cooking equipment relative to the particular food that you're making. And I think you'll be able to come up with a reference chart eventually that may be helpful to you. Okay, thank you. And then the last item from Julietta. When removing vegetables from iced water after submersion cooking, should they get to be room temperature or cooler than room temperature? This is a great question. So we're talking about the ice bath, okay? And basically what we're trying to do when we're using an ice bath is to stop the cooking process. Because once we remove a food item from a pot of simmering water or boiling water, okay, there's still a lot of heat packed in that item, and we call that carryover cooking that takes place. In other words, that residual heat will continue the cooking process. And an item that was pulled from that hot water at a just right sort of point in time will become overcooked if it's not placed in an ice bath to stop the cooking. And so typically what we're doing is we're extracting the heat until the item becomes cold, okay? And then that item is going to be used at some later point in time. Now, if you plan to use that item right away, then you don't need to necessarily bring it down to a very cold state. You have some control there, okay? But this is kind of an interesting space to play in, and will require some experimentation on your part. All right, so keep in mind that if you were to bring that item down to a very cold state, in other words, extracting or as much heat as possible, then you're going to have the most control at that next stage of reheating or finishing the item. In a certain way, there's more nuance to this than I think I can get into verbally here, but yeah, again, if you are going to reheat that item immediately, then sure, arguably you can bring it down to something close to room temperature and then strain it and then continue. Okay, but it's going to require some experimentation on your part to find what is going to work best for you. Okay, but I encourage experimentation. Okay, in order to find ways forward that best fit your way of cooking. Thank you very much. And that brings us to the end of today's list of questions. And I want to thank all of you for your participation. And I look forward to you once again as I hold my next round of office hours. In the meantime, happy cooking. Bye-bye. All right. Thank you. Good job, Richard.